When 8-year-old Luna Martinez stood before the school board and declared she wanted her janitor father to adopt her instead of living with her billionaire biological father, the room fell silent, until she revealed the heartbreaking reason that would expose a truth so devastating it would change everything they thought they knew about love, family, and what it really means to be a parent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Blackstone Industries' 47th floor conference room, each drop racing down the glass like tears the building itself was crying. Inside, the mahogany table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. At the head of that table sat Alexander Blackstone, his perfectly tailored suit immaculate as always, reviewing quarterly projections that showed his tech empire continuing its relentless march toward global dominance. At 38, Alexander had everything the world told him he should want: the penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, the private jet, the cover stories in Fortune magazine that called him the Titan of Silicon Valley. His cybersecurity software had revolutionized 3 industries. His investment portfolio could fund small countries, and his name commanded respect in boardrooms from New York to Tokyo. But as he sat alone in his corner office at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night, surrounded by the trappings of success, Alexander felt the familiar hollow ache that no amount of money had ever been able to fill. His phone sat silent on the desk. No missed calls from friends, no text messages from family, no one wondering where he was or if he was okay. Just the endless stream of business notifications that kept him tethered to a world that valued his mind but had no use for his heart. The elevator chimed softly in the hallway, and Alexander frowned. The building should have been empty except for security and the night-cleaning crew. He glanced at his Rolex. 9:47 p.m. Who could possibly be coming to see him at this hour? A soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting to see his assistant with some urgent document that couldn't wait until morning. Instead, the door opened to reveal a small figure silhouetted against the hallway lights. A child stepped into the office. A little girl with auburn curls escaping from a slightly crooked ponytail, wearing a simple yellow dress that had clearly seen better days, and carrying a worn stuffed rabbit under one arm. Alexander blinked, certain he was hallucinating from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Excuse me, who are you?" The child stepped further into the office, her sneakers squeaking softly against the marble floor. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with green eyes that seemed far too serious for her young face, and a dusting of freckles across her nose. "Hi," the little girl said, her voice clear but trembling slightly. "Are you the man who owns this building?" Yes, I am, but you shouldn't be here. Where are your parents? How did you get past security?" Alexander stood, his business instincts kicking in, even as he struggled to process the surreal situation. "My dad works here," the child said simply. "He's cleaning the offices downstairs. I'm supposed to wait in the break room, but I needed to ask you something really important." Alexander moved around his desk, studying the little girl more closely. There was something achingly familiar about her features, though he couldn't place why. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Luna Martinez. My dad says I might have a different last name because of where I came from, but Martinez is who I am." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. "My dad says you're because you made me with my birth mom, but I don't really understand what that means." The world tilted sideways. Alexander gripped the edge of his desk, his legs suddenly unsteady. "Your father, what's your father's name?" "Diego Martinez. He cleans the offices here at night, so he can take care of me during the day. He's really good at fixing things, and he makes the best pancakes in the whole world, and he reads me stories every night, even when he's tired." Luna clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. "He says you're very important and very busy, but that maybe you might want to meet me someday." Diego. The name crashed through Alexander's carefully constructed walls like a wrecking ball, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. Not Diego directly, but the woman Diego had been married to, Isabella Martinez, the brilliant graduate student who'd worked as a research assistant in Alexander's lab. Isabella, with her warm laugh and gentle hands and eyes that saw straight through to Alexander's soul. Isabella, who had loved him completely and unconditionally, until Alexander's own fear and family pressure had destroyed everything beautiful between them. He told you about me?" Alexander's voice came out as barely a whisper. "A little bit. He says you're very smart, and you help make computers safe from bad people. He says you work very hard, and that's why you couldn't be my dad." Luna tilted her head, studying Alexander with that unnervingly direct gaze that children possessed. "But he also gets sad sometimes when he looks at pictures, and he thinks I don't notice, but I do." Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. "Pictures? There's one in his dresser drawer. It's a lady who looks like me, and she's with you, and you both look really happy. Happier than Dad looks now, even when he's smiling." Luna took a step closer. "Dad says she was my birth mom and that she went to heaven when I was little. Are you sad about her too?" The question was so innocent, so pure, that it cut through every defense Alexander had built around his heart. Isabella, gone. And this child, their child, being raised by the man Isabella had married after Alexander's family had driven her away. "Luna," he said slowly, "what did you want to ask me?" The little girl straightened her shoulders as if preparing for something very important. "Dad says we might have to move away soon because the rent keeps going up and he can't afford it anymore. He tries to hide it, but I heard him on the phone talking about money." Luna's voice got smaller. "I don't want to move away from here, because Dad likes his job and he says Mr. Peterson, who manages the cleaning crew, is nice to him." Alexander felt something crack open in his chest. "And? I wanted to ask if maybe you could help us stay, not because you have to, but because—" Luna paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because Dad says family helps family, and he says you're my other dad, even if you don't act like it." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Alexander had been too afraid to cross for 8 long years. He stared at this remarkable little girl who had somehow found the courage to walk into the lion's den and ask for help, not for herself, but for the man who had raised her with love. "Luna," Alexander said carefully, "does your dad know you're here?" "No, he thinks I'm in the break room doing my homework. But I finished early, and I've been thinking about this for a long time." Luna hugged her stuffed rabbit closer. "I know you don't know me, and maybe you don't want to know me, but Dad is the best person in the whole world, and he deserves good things. He takes care of everyone, me and Mrs. Chen next door, and the stray cat that lives behind our building. He deserves someone to take care of him too." Alexander felt tears threatening for the first time in years. This child, his child, had inherited not only Isabella's enormous heart but also her protective instincts. She was willing to face a stranger, even one as intimidating as Alexander, to protect the man who meant everything to her. "You love your dad very much," Alexander observed. "More than anything, he's my whole family." Luna's eyes grew fierce with an 8-year-old's absolute certainty. "I would do anything to make sure he's okay. Anything." In that moment, Alexander saw something that made his breath catch. This child was willing to sacrifice everything for love, the same way Isabella had been. But where Isabella's love had been met with Alexander's cowardice, Luna's was being met with something different: recognition, understanding, and perhaps, finally, courage. "Would you like to sit down?" Alexander asked gently, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Luna nodded and climbed into the chair, her small frame nearly swallowed by the expensive leather. She placed her stuffed rabbit carefully on her lap and looked at Alexander with patient expectation. Alexander returned to his own chair, his mind reeling with the implications of this moment. Here was the daughter he'd never known, the child born from the greatest love and the greatest loss of his life. And she was asking not for riches or recognition, but simply for the chance to stay close to the man who had given her everything when Alexander had given her nothing. "Luna," Alexander said slowly, "I think we need to have a very important conversation. But first, I need to ask you something. Are you happy? With your dad? With your life?" "Very happy," Luna said without hesitation. "Dad says we don't have a lot of money, but we have a lot of love. He teaches me things like how to make pancakes and how to be kind to people, and how to read really good books. And he always has time for me, even when he's tired from working all night." Alexander nodded, something fundamental shifting in his understanding of what success really meant. "He sounds like an amazing father." "The best," Luna agreed. Then she leaned forward slightly. "So, will you help us?" Will you make sure we don't have to move away? As Alexander looked into those earnest green eyes, so much like Isabella's, yet uniquely Luna's own, he realized that this moment was going to change everything. Not just Luna's life, or Diego's, but his own. Because sitting across from her was proof that love didn't always look like what the world expected, and that sometimes the most important decisions were made, not in boardrooms, but in quiet moments when a child was brave enough to ask for what her family needed. Yes, Alexander said quietly, I'll help. But Luna, there's something I need you to understand. This conversation, what happens next, it's going to be complicated. Are you ready for that? Luna nodded solemnly, clutching her rabbit. I'm ready. As long as Dad is okay, I'm ready for anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexander stared at Luna for a long moment, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or market projections. This child, this remarkable little girl who had walked into his office with the confidence of someone twice her age, was asking him to help the very man who had taken everything from him 8 years ago. Luna, he said carefully, before we talk about helping your dad, I need to understand something. Tell me about him. What kind of father is he? Luna's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that Alexander hadn't seen in his corporate world for years. Dad is the best. He gets up early every morning to make me breakfast before school, even though he doesn't go to sleep until really late because of his work. And he knows all the words to my favorite songs, and he lets me help him fix things around our apartment. She shifted in the oversized leather chair, her small legs swinging as she spoke. When I have bad dreams, he sits with me until I fall asleep again. And when kids at school are mean, because we don't have nice clothes or a big house, he tells me that being rich in love is better than being rich in money. Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow. This was everything he'd never learned how to be: present, patient, selfless. While he'd been building his empire, Diego Martinez had been building something infinitely more valuable: a relationship with his daughter. He sounds wonderful, Alexander managed. And your birth mother, does he talk about her? Luna nodded solemnly. Sometimes. He says she was the most beautiful person he ever knew, inside and out. He has pictures of her holding me when I was a baby. She paused, tilting her head with that unnervingly direct gaze. He says she loved you very much, but that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they care about. The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Alexander's throat tightened as memories flooded back. Isabella's tears the last time he'd seen her, her voice breaking as she told him about the pregnancy. His mother's cold ultimatum: choose the family business and fortune, or throw it all away for some girl from the wrong side of town. His cowardice in letting Isabella walk away, convinced that his family's money and influence would somehow make everything work out. He'd been 29 and thought he was making the practical choice. He'd told himself Isabella would be better off without him, that she'd find someone who could give her the simple, honest life she deserved. What he'd never imagined was that she would find exactly that with Diego. Luna, Alexander said slowly, does your dad ever seem angry about the situation, about having to raise you alone after your mother died? Angry. Luna looked genuinely confused by the question. Why would he be angry? He says I'm the best thing that ever happened to him. He says Mom left us both the greatest gift in the world when she gave me to him. The innocence of her response nearly undid him. Here was a child who had been loved so completely, so unconditionally, that she couldn't even conceive of being seen as a burden. Diego hadn't just taken care of Isabella's daughter, he'd embraced her as his own, given her a security and stability that Alexander had never experienced in his own childhood. Mr. Blackstone? Luna's voice broke through his thoughts. Are you okay? You look sad. Alexander blinked, realizing that tears had gathered in his eyes. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some things from a long time ago. Dad says thinking about sad things from the past can make you forget about the good things happening right now. Luna leaned forward earnestly. So maybe you should think about good things instead, like how you can help us stay here so Dad doesn't have to worry anymore. The simplicity of her logic was both heartbreaking and humbling. While Alexander had spent 8 years drowning in regret and building walls around his heart, this 8-year-old had learned to focus on solutions, on hope, on the people she loved. You're very wise for someone so young, he said. Dad teaches me stuff. He says wisdom isn't about knowing everything, it's about caring about the right things. Luna swung her legs again, her sneakers bumping softly against the chair. And I care about Dad more than anything. Alexander nodded, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Luna, would you like to see your dad? I think it's time we all had a conversation together. Her eyes widened with excitement. Really? You want to meet him? I think I need to meet him, Alexander corrected gently. Wait here for just a moment, okay? He stood and walked to his desk, pressing the intercom button that connected him to building security. This is Alexander Blackstone. I need you to locate Diego Martinez from the cleaning crew and ask him to come to my office immediately. Tell him his daughter is here and safe, but that we need to speak with him. Right away, Mr. Blackstone, came the crisp reply. Alexander returned to his seat, studying Luna's face as they waited. Now that he knew who she was, he could see Isabella in every feature. The shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. But there was something else there too, something that made his chest tighten with recognition. She had his intensity, his ability to focus completely on what mattered to her. Luna, he said carefully, when your dad gets here, he might be surprised to see me. Adults sometimes have complicated feelings about things that happened before you were born. You mean like how he gets quiet sometimes when he looks at Mom's pictures? Something like that, yes. Luna considered this with the seriousness of a child who had learned to read the emotional currents around her. Are you going to be nice to him? Because he's really good, even if some people don't think janitors are important. He works harder than anybody I know. I'm going to try to be the kind of man your mother would have wanted me to be, Alexander said quietly. Before Luna could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Rapid, worried footsteps that spoke of a father's panic at learning his child was in an unexpected place. The office door opened, and Diego Martinez stepped inside. Alexander's breath caught. Diego was nothing like what he'd expected. He'd imagined someone older, weathered by hard work and harder choices. Instead, he saw a man in his early 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands, wearing the simple uniform of the cleaning crew, but carrying himself with a dignity that had nothing to do with job titles or bank accounts. Luna, Diego's voice was filled with relief as he spotted his daughter. Miguel, what are you doing here? You scared me to death. Luna jumped down from her chair and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. I'm sorry, Papa. I wanted to ask Mr. Blackstone something important, and I couldn't wait. Diego's eyes met Alexander's over Luna's head, and in that moment, the air in the room shifted. Recognition flickered across Diego's face. Not personal recognition, but the understanding of who Alexander was and what his presence might mean. Mr. Blackstone, Diego said carefully, his voice steady despite the tension Alexander could see in his shoulders. I apologize for any disturbance. Luna isn't usually so direct in her approach to problem solving. Alexander stood slowly, struck by the grace in Diego's manner. Even faced with his daughter's biological father, even clearly understanding the power dynamic at play, Diego's first concern was protecting Luna from any awkwardness or discomfort. Please, call me Alexander. And Luna wasn't disturbing anything. She was... He paused, searching for the right words. She was being exactly the kind of daughter any father would be proud of. Something flickered in Diego's eyes at those words. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of hope. Papa, Luna said, pulling back to look up at her father's face. Mr. Alexander says he wants to help us so we don't have to move away. Isn't that wonderful? Diego's hands moved to rest protectively on Luna's shoulders. Misha, these things are complicated. Mr. Blackstone is a very busy man with many important responsibilities. Actually, Alexander said, stepping forward, there's nothing more important than this conversation. Diego, would you mind if we talked, all three of us together? Diego studied Alexander's face for a long moment, clearly weighing risks and possibilities. Finally, he nodded. If that's what you want, sir. It's what I need, Alexander corrected. And Diego, thank you for everything you've done for her, for everything you've been to her. I can see that she's... His voice caught slightly. She's exactly the kind of person Isabella would have wanted her to become. Diego's expression softened, and for the first time since entering the office, his shoulders relaxed slightly. Isabella was an amazing woman. Luna has her mother's heart and her father's strength, Alexander added quietly, meaning every word. As the three of them settled into chairs around Alexander's desk, Luna between the two men who represented such different chapters of her story, Alexander realized that this conversation would determine not just whether they stayed in the city, but whether he would finally have the chance to become the father he should have been 8 years ago. The question was, would Diego trust him enough to let him try? The silence stretched between the three of them like a taut wire ready to snap. Alexander found himself studying Diego's face, searching for signs of resentment or anger, but finding only a careful wariness that spoke of a man protecting what mattered most to him. Diego's hands rested gently on Luna's shoulders, an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship. "So," Diego said finally, his voice measured, "Luna tells me you might be able to help with our housing situation. That's very generous of you, Mr. Blackstone, but I have to ask, why? What's your interest in helping a janitor you've never met?" Alexander felt the weight of that question settle around him like a heavy coat. How could he explain 8 years of regret, of wondering what might have been, of building a fortune that felt meaningless without anyone to share it with? How could he tell this man that he'd failed Isabella in every way that mattered, and that seeing Luna, their daughter, had awakened something in him he thought was dead? "Because Luna asked," Alexander said simply, "and because—" He paused, glancing at Luna, who was watching both men with the intense focus of a child who understood that something important was happening. "Because I knew her mother." Diego's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I figured as much. Luna mentioned you worked with Isabella before she died." "We were." Alexander struggled with how much to reveal in front of Luna. "We were close, very close. And when she died, I realized I'd lost something I can never get back." "Papa worked with Mama too," Luna piped up, oblivious to the undercurrents flowing between the two men. "He was a maintenance worker at the hospital where she was a nurse. He says she was the kindest person to everyone, especially the patients who were scared." Alexander blinked. A nurse? Isabella had been studying to be a research scientist when he'd known her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. After he'd abandoned her, she'd changed her entire life path. Instead of pursuing advanced degrees in laboratory work, she'd chosen a profession centered on caring for others, on being present in moments of vulnerability and need. "She became a nurse," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "The best one at Mercy General," Diego said, and there was no hiding the pride in his voice. She could calm a crying child with just her voice, could make the elderly patients feel like they weren't alone. The doctors used to say she had magic hands. His expression softened as he looked down at Luna. She brought that same magic home every day. "How did you—" Alexander began, then stopped himself. He had no right to ask about their relationship, about how Diego had won the heart Alexander had been too cowardly to fight for. But Diego seemed to understand the unfinished question. "Isabella was working a double shift when I brought my nephew to the ER. He'd fallen off his bike, needed stitches. She stayed with us the whole time, even though her shift had ended hours earlier. Just sat there telling him stories while the doctor worked, making him laugh instead of cry." Luna beamed. "I love that story. Tell him about the dinosaur story, Papa." "She told this elaborate tale about brave dinosaurs who protected their families," Diego continued, his voice warming with the memory. "Had my nephew convinced that his bandages were actually dinosaur armor. When we were leaving, I asked if I could buy her coffee to thank her. She said yes, but only if I let her pay for her own. Said she didn't believe in owing anyone anything." Alexander felt something twist in his chest. That was so perfectly Isabella. Independent, proud, refusing to be anyone's charity case. It's exactly what had made his family's interference so devastating to her. "6 months later we were married," Diego said simply. "Not because she was pregnant. We found out about Luna after the wedding. We married because I'd never met anyone who made me want to be a better man just by existing in the same room." The words hit Alexander like a sledgehammer. Diego was describing exactly what Alexander had felt about Isabella, exactly what he'd been too afraid to pursue. While he'd been paralyzed by his family's expectations and his own cowardice, Diego had recognized something precious and fought for it. "And Luna?" Alexander asked quietly. "When you found out Isabella was pregnant." "Best day of my life," Diego said without hesitation, his hands tightening protectively on Luna's shoulders. "Isabella was scared at first, worried about money, about whether we were ready. But I told her that some gifts you don't question, You just accept with gratitude. Luna twisted in her chair to grin up at Diego. And then you painted my nursery yellow because you wanted it to be happy no matter if I was a boy or a girl. Sunny yellow, Diego confirmed, ruffling her hair. Like your mama's smile. Alexander watched this exchange with a growing ache in his chest. This was what he'd missed. Not just Luna's birth and childhood, but the chance to be the kind of man who painted nurseries yellow and told dinosaur stories and stayed up all night with a sick child. Diego hadn't just married Isabella. He'd embraced the whole complicated package of loving a pregnant woman whose heart had been broken by someone else. Mr. Blackstone, Diego said, drawing Alexander's attention back to the present, I appreciate whatever help you're willing to offer, but I need to understand something. Luna mentioned that you're her, that Isabella was pregnant when you knew her. Is that true? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander looked at Luna, who was watching him with those unnervingly direct green eyes. His eyes, he realized now. She deserved the truth, but more than that, Diego deserved the truth. This man had earned the right to honesty through 8 years of selfless love. Yes, Alexander said quietly. Isabella was pregnant when she left. I didn't know. She didn't tell me, but yes, Luna is my biological daughter. Diego's face went carefully blank, but Alexander caught the slight tightening around his eyes. I see. And you're just learning this now? Tonight. When Luna told me her name, when she mentioned Isabella, Alexander ran a hand through his hair. I've been looking for Isabella for 8 years. I hired private investigators, checked hospital records, tried everything. I never found any trace of her after she left the city. Because she changed her name when we married, Diego said simply. Isabella Rodriguez, not Isabella Moreno. She wanted a fresh start. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Isabella had been so determined to escape her past, escape him, that she'd erased every trace of who she'd been before Diego. She'd chosen a new identity, a new life, a new family that had nothing to do with Alexander Blackstone, and everything to do with building something real with a man who'd proven himself worthy of her trust. Papa? Luna said suddenly, her voice small and confused. Are you mad? You look mad. Diego's expression immediately softened as he looked down at her. No, mija, I'm not mad, just thinking about some complicated grown-up things. Is it because Mr. Alexander is my other papa? Luna asked with the devastating directness that only children possessed. Because you'll always be my real papa, no matter what. You're the one who taught me to ride my bike and helped me with my homework and read me bedtime stories. Biology doesn't make someone a dad, love does. The words came out with such matter-of-fact certainty that both men fell silent. Luna looked between them, clearly frustrated by their inability to grasp something that seemed obvious to her 8-year-old logic. Besides, she continued, maybe it's good that I have 2 papas now. That means twice as many people to help when you need it, right, Papa? Diego's throat worked as he swallowed hard. Luna, sweetheart, it's not quite that simple. Why not? Luna interrupted. Mr. Alexander has lots of money but no family to share it with. We have lots of love, but sometimes not enough money. Seems like we could help each other. Alexander found himself smiling, despite the emotional chaos swirling through him. You know, Luna, for an 8-year-old, you have some pretty sophisticated ideas about resource allocation. I don't know what that means, Luna said cheerfully, but if it means I'm smart, then thank you. Diego was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Luna and Alexander. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Blackstone, Alexander, I need you to understand something. Luna isn't just Isabella's daughter to me. She's mine. Has been since the day she was born. I was there for her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I've been the one she calls for when she has nightmares. The one who knows exactly how she likes her sandwiches cut and what songs calm her down when she's upset. I know, Alexander said quietly, and I'm not trying to take that away from you. I wouldn't even know how to begin being what you are to her. Then what do you want? Diego asked bluntly. What's your endgame here? Alexander looked at Luna, who was watching him with hopeful eyes, then back at Diego. I want to learn how to be worthy of her. I want to understand what Isabella saw in you that she couldn't see in me. And I want to make sure that the 2 most important people in Isabella's life never have to worry about having a roof over their heads or food on their table again. "We don't need charity," Diego said, his pride evident in every word. "It's not charity," Alexander replied. "It's responsibility. Luna is my daughter, which makes you family by extension, and families take care of each other." Luna clapped her hands together. "See? I told you it would work out." Diego looked down at her, his expression a mixture of love, exasperation, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. "Micha, you make everything sound so simple." "Because it is simple," Luna insisted. "The only complicated part is when grown-ups forget that being scared is okay. But being scared shouldn't stop you from doing good things." As Alexander looked at this remarkable child, his daughter, sitting between him and the man who had given her everything Alexander had failed to provide, he realized that Luna was absolutely right. The situation was complicated, but the solution didn't have to be. The question now was whether Diego would trust him enough to let him try to prove himself worthy of being part of their family. 2 weeks later, Alexander found himself doing something he'd never done in his 8 years as CEO, leaving the office at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday to attend a school function. Luna had shyly invited him to her class presentation on community heroes, and despite Diego's obvious reluctance, she'd insisted that both her fathers should be there. The elementary school gymnasium buzzed with the energy of proud parents and nervous children. Alexander adjusted his tie, feeling more out of place than he had in any boardroom negotiation. His Armani suit stood out starkly among the casual clothes of other parents, and he caught more than a few curious glances as he searched for familiar faces. He spotted Diego near the back, wearing his best button-down shirt and looking equally uncomfortable, though for different reasons. Their eyes met across the room, and Diego nodded politely, the same careful courtesy he'd maintained since their conversation in Alexander's office. "Papa!" Luna's voice carried across the gymnasium as she bounded toward Diego, her costume rustling with each step. She wore a simple white dress with a cardboard badge pinned to her chest that read Nurse Hero, and she carried a toy stethoscope around her neck. Alexander watched as Diego's face transformed the moment he saw her, all the wariness and tension melting away, replaced by pure adoration. He knelt down to Luna's level, adjusting her costume with gentle hands. "You look perfect, mija," Diego said softly. "Mama would be so proud." "Do you think so? I practiced my speech 100 times. Luna's excitement was infectious, and Alexander found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "Mr. Alexander!" Luna spotted him and waved enthusiastically. "You came. Papa, look, you really came." Alexander approached slowly, acutely aware of the eyes following him. "I wouldn't miss it for anything, Luna. You look wonderful." She beamed at him, then grabbed both men by the hands. "Come sit together in the front row. I want to be able to see both of you when I talk." Alexander glanced at Diego, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Diego, if you'd prefer to sit separately." "Luna wants us together," Diego said quietly. "What Luna wants, Luna gets." They found seats in the front row, Luna between them, chattering excitedly about her presentation. Alexander tried to focus on her words, but he found himself stealing glances at Diego, noting things he hadn't observed during their brief, formal interactions over the past 2 weeks. The way Diego automatically reached over to smooth Luna's hair when it got messed up. How he knew without being told that she was nervous because she was bouncing her right leg, and placed a gentle hand on her knee to calm her. The proud smile that never left his face as he listened to her excited rambling about her classmates' presentations. These were the unconscious gestures of a father who knew his child completely, who could read her moods and needs without effort. Alexander had been studying Luna like a fascinating puzzle for 2 weeks, but Diego understood her like breathing. "And Tommy is doing his presentation on firefighters, which is good because his dad is a firefighter, so he knows lots of real stuff," Luna was saying. "But I think nurses are more important because they help people feel better when they're scared, just like Mama did." "That's a very good point," Alexander said, and he meant it. "Your mother was exceptional at making people feel safe." Diego shot him a sharp look. "You keep talking about Isabella like you knew her well, but Luna told me you only worked together." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander felt Luna's curious gaze moving between them, sensing an undercurrent she couldn't quite understand. "We worked closely together," Alexander said carefully. "On several important projects, she made an impression." "What kind of impression?" Diego's voice was deceptively casual, but Alexander caught the steel underneath. Before Alexander could answer, the teacher called for attention, and Luna jumped up to take her place with the other presenters. As she walked to the front of the gymnasium, Alexander noticed something that made his breath catch. Luna had a small habit when she was nervous. She would touch her ear and then straighten her shoulders, as if steeling herself for whatever came next. It was a gesture so subtle that most people would miss it, but Alexander recognized it immediately because he did the exact same thing before important presentations. Diego noticed his stare. "What?" "Nothing, I just—" Alexander paused, watching Luna take her position at the makeshift podium. "Does she always do that thing with her ear when she's nervous?" "Since she was tiny." "Why?" Alexander touched his own ear unconsciously, the gesture so automatic he didn't realize he was doing it until he saw Diego's eyes widen with recognition. "Son of a—" Diego started, then caught himself, glancing around the gymnasium full of families. "I don't even realize I do it," Alexander said quietly. "It's just something that happens when I'm about to speak in public." They watched in silence as Luna began her presentation, her small voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium's sound system. She spoke about her mother with a poise that belied her 8 years, describing Isabella's work at the hospital with a kind of detail that could only come from someone who had listened to countless bedtime stories about healing and helping others. "My mama was a nurse at Mercy General Hospital," Luna said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She took care of people when they were sick and scared. Papa says she had magic hands that could make anyone feel better just by touching them." Alexander watched Diego's face as Luna spoke, seeing the mix of pride and pain that crossed his features. This was still hard for him. Talking about Isabella, sharing her memory with others, especially with the man who had known her before. "But the most important thing about Mama," Luna continued, "was that she taught me that heroes aren't just people who save the day once. Heroes are people who show up every single day and choose to take care of the people they love, even when it's hard." She looked directly at Diego as she said this, and Alexander saw the man's throat work as he swallowed hard. "That's why my papa is my hero too," Luna said, her voice warm with affection. "Because even when Mama went to heaven, he stayed with me. He makes sure I have everything I need, and he reads me stories and he teaches me how to be brave like Mama was." Alexander found himself studying Diego's profile as Luna spoke, noting things he'd been too focused on his own discomfort to see before. The slight tremor in Diego's hands as he listened to Luna's tribute. The way his jaw tightened when she mentioned Isabella's death. The fierce pride and love that radiated from him as he watched his daughter, their daughter, speak with confidence and grace about the woman who had shaped both their lives. When Luna finished her presentation to enthusiastic applause, she practically bounced back to her seat between them. "Did I do good? Was I loud enough? Could you hear everything?" "You were perfect," Diego said, his voice rough with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." "Mr. Alexander, what did you think?" Alexander looked at this remarkable child, then at the man who had raised her with such obvious love and devotion. "I think your mother would be incredibly proud of both of you," he said honestly. As the evening wound down and other families began to leave, Luna skipped ahead to say goodbye to her teacher, leaving Alexander and Diego walking behind her in uncomfortably loaded silence. "She's remarkable," Alexander said finally. "She gets that from Isabella," Diego replied, but there was less hostility in his voice than before. "And from you. The confidence, the way she speaks to adults like equals. That's not something that just happens, that's something that's taught, nurtured." Diego glanced at him sideways. "You sound surprised." "I am surprised. Not by Luna, by you." Alexander stopped walking, forcing Diego to face him. "I expected to dislike you. I expected to find reasons why Isabella settling for someone less made sense. But watching you with her tonight, seeing how completely she trusts you, how secure she is in your love. But I'm realizing that Isabella didn't settle for less. She found exactly what she needed, what they both needed." Alexander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm starting to understand that I wasn't the father Luna needed." "You were." Diego stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You're not what I expected either," he admitted grudgingly. "What did you expect?" "Someone arrogant. Someone who thought money could fix everything or buy their way into situations they hadn't earned." Diego paused, watching Luna as she hugged her teacher goodbye. Someone who would try to take her away from me. I would never do that. I couldn't do that, even if I wanted to. She's yours in every way that matters. Then what do you want from this? From us? Alexander watched Luna skip back toward them, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. I want to learn how to be someone she could be proud to call family. And I want to understand how you became the kind of man Isabella chose over me. As Luna reached them, chattering excitedly about her classmates, presentations, and the cookies the PTA had provided, Alexander realized that his growing suspicion was becoming a certainty. This wasn't just about providing financial help or assuaging his guilt about the past. He was beginning to see that Diego Martinez wasn't just Luna's father. He was the man Alexander should have been all along. And if there was any chance of building a real relationship with his daughter, he was going to have to learn from the man who had succeeded where he had failed so completely. Saturday afternoon found Alexander standing outside Luna and Diego's apartment building, holding a toolbox he'd purchased that morning and feeling more nervous than he had before any corporate merger. Luna had mentioned during one of their weekly dinners that the kitchen faucet was dripping and keeping her awake at night, and Diego had been saving up to call a plumber. Their shoulders brushed as Diego reached for the pipe, and Alexander caught a whiff of paint and something that might have been Luna's strawberry shampoo. It struck him that this was probably the closest he'd ever been to domestic life, crammed under a kitchen sink with grease on his shirt, and a child chattering happily beside him. Like this? Alexander adjusted his grip on the wrench according to Diego's guidance. Perfect. Now turn it counterclockwise. There, you've got it. Working together, they managed to identify and fix the source of the drip in about 20 minutes. When Alexander finally emerged from under the sink, both he and Diego were dusty and slightly sweaty, but Luna was bouncing with excitement. It worked! Listen, no more dripping. She pressed her ear to the cabinet door as if the absence of the sound was the most beautiful music she'd ever heard. You did good, Diego said to Alexander, and there was genuine respect in his voice. Better than I expected for someone who mostly lives in boardrooms. I had a good teacher, Alexander replied, meaning it. Can we paint now? Luna asked. Mr. Alexander, do you want to help paint my room? It's going to be beautiful. Alexander looked down at his already dirty clothes, then at Luna's hopeful face. I'd love to, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such an important project. It's easy. Papa will teach you, won't you, Papa? Diego hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. If you want to learn, I can show you the basics. An hour later, Alexander found himself standing on a stepladder in Luna's bedroom, carefully rolling ocean blue paint onto the wall, while Luna supervised from her bed and Diego worked on the opposite wall. The radio played softly in the background, some Spanish station that Diego had tuned to, and the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, making the wet paint gleam. Tell me about your room when you were little, Luna said, swinging her legs over the edge of her bed. Was it big like in the movies? Alexander paused in his painting, thinking about the enormous bedroom of his childhood, all dark wood and expensive furniture that he'd been afraid to touch. It was big, he said finally, but not very cheerful, nothing like this. What color were the walls? Brown. Dark brown, with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the light. Luna wrinkled her nose. That sounds sad. Did you have toys? Some. But I wasn't really supposed to play with them in my room. There was a playroom down the hall that I could use for an hour after homework was finished. Diego had stopped painting and was listening with a frown. An hour? My parents believed in structure. Scheduled activities. Everything had its time and place. Alexander dipped his roller in the paint tray, remembering the rigid routine of his childhood. I had tutors for music and languages, scheduled physical exercise, educational television programs. Very efficient. But not very fun, Luna observed. No, not very fun. That's why you don't know how to fix sinks or paint walls, she concluded with 8-year-old logic. Because nobody taught you house stuff, just business stuff. Exactly. Diego set down his roller and turned to face Alexander fully. That explains a lot, actually. What do you mean? Why Isabella was so worried about... Diego caught himself, glancing at Luna. About what? Alexander pressed. About whether you'd know how to be a real father. Not just someone who provided money and opportunities, but someone who could be present for the small things. Diego's voice was careful, but not unkind. She used to say that some people know how to love people, and some people only know how to love ideas of people. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Luna had jumped down from her bed and was examining both men's painting technique. "You're both doing good, but Papa, you missed a spot up there," she said, pointing to a corner near the ceiling. "And Mr. Alexander, you're being too careful. Paint is supposed to be a little messy. That's what makes it fun." "A little messy," Alexander repeated, looking at his precisely painted section. "Like this." Luna grabbed a brush and added a playful swirl to one small section of her wall. "See? Now it has personality." "Did your papa teach you about tools?" Luna asked, watching Alexander struggle with a particularly stubborn bolt. "No, not really. My father was more of a meeting person. He solved problems by talking to other people who solved problems." "That sounds boring," Luna said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "It was," Alexander admitted, surprised by his own candor. "Very boring." Diego had been hovering in the doorway, clearly torn between wanting to help and not wanting to interfere, but Luna's comment seemed to break through his reserve. "Here," he said, kneeling beside Alexander. "That connection is tricky. You have to approach it from this angle." Their shoulders brushed as Diego reached for the pipe, and Alexander caught a whiff of paint and something that might have been Luna's strawberry shampoo. It struck him that this was probably the closest he'd ever been to domestic life, crammed under a kitchen sink with grease on his shirt and a child chattering happily beside him. "Like this?" Alexander adjusted his grip on the wrench according to Diego's guidance. "Perfect. Now turn it counterclockwise. There, you've got it." Working together, they managed to identify and fix the source of the drip in about 20 minutes. When Alexander finally emerged from under the sink, both he and Diego were dusty and slightly sweaty, but Luna was bouncing with excitement. "It worked!" "Listen, no more dripping." She pressed her ear to the cabinet door as if the absence of the sound was the most beautiful music she'd ever heard. "You did good," Diego said to Alexander, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "Better than I expected for someone who mostly lives in boardrooms." "I had a good teacher," Alexander replied, meaning it. "Can we paint now?" Luna asked. "Mr. Alexander, do you want to help paint my room? It's going to be beautiful." Alexander looked down at his already dirty clothes, then at Luna's hopeful face. "I'd love to, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such an important project." "It's easy. Papa will teach you, won't you, Papa?" Diego hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "If you want to learn, I can show you the basics." An hour later, Alexander found himself standing on a stepladder in Luna's bedroom, carefully rolling ocean blue paint onto the wall, while Luna supervised from her bed, and Diego worked on the opposite wall. The radio played softly in the background, some Spanish station that Diego had tuned to, and the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, making the wet paint gleam. "Tell me about your room when you were little," Luna said, swinging her legs over the edge of her bed. "Was it big like in the movies?" Alexander paused in his painting, thinking about the enormous bedroom of his childhood, all dark wood and expensive furniture that he'd been afraid to touch. "It was big," he said finally, "but not very cheerful, nothing like this." "What color were the walls?" "Brown. Dark brown with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the light." Luna wrinkled her nose. "That sounds sad. Did you have toys?" "Some. But I wasn't really supposed to play with them in my room. There was a playroom down the hall that I could use for an hour after homework was finished." Diego had stopped painting and was listening with a frown. "An hour?" "My parents believed in structure, scheduled activities. Everything had its time and place." Alexander dipped his roller in the paint tray, remembering the rigid routine of his childhood. "I had tutors for music and languages, scheduled physical exercise, educational television programs, very efficient." "But not very fun," Luna observed. "No, not very fun." "That's why you don't know how to fix sinks or paint walls," she concluded with 8-year-old logic. "Because nobody taught you house stuff, just business stuff." "Exactly." Diego set down his roller and turned to face Alexander fully. "That explains a lot, actually." "What do you mean?" "Why Isabella was so worried about—" Diego caught himself, glancing at Luna. "About what?" Alexander pressed. about whether you'd know how to be a real father. Not just someone who provided money and opportunities, but someone who could be present for the small things. Diego's voice was careful, but not unkind. She used to say that some people know how to love people, and some people only know how to love ideas of people. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Luna had jumped down from her bed and was examining both men's painting technique. "You're both doing good, but Papa, you missed a spot up there," she said, pointing to a corner near the ceiling. "And Mr. Alexander, you're being too careful. Paint is supposed to be a little messy. That's what makes it fun." "A little messy," Alexander repeated, looking at his precisely painted section. "Like this!" Luna grabbed a brush and added a playful swirl to one small section of her wall. "See? Now it has personality." Diego laughed, the first truly relaxed laugh Alexander had heard from him. "Mija, that's not how we paint walls." "It's how I paint walls," Luna said with dignity, "and it's my room." Alexander found himself laughing too, and for a moment, the three of them were just people working together on a project that mattered to a little girl who wanted her room to be the color of whale oceans. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander began to understand something that had never been clear to him before. This wasn't just about Luna. It was about the kind of life Diego had built for her. A life where Saturday afternoons were spent painting rooms and fixing faucets, where problems were solved with patient creativity rather than money, where a child's opinion about paint colors mattered enough to visit 17 different stores. When they finally finished the room, Luna stood in the doorway and clapped her hands together. "It's perfect! It's exactly like I imagined." Alexander looked around the small room with its fresh ocean blue walls, mismatched furniture, and the single playful swirl that Luna had added, and realized she was absolutely right. It was perfect. Not because it was expensive or professionally done, but because it was filled with love and attention and the kind of care that couldn't be purchased. "Thank you for letting me help," he said to Diego as they cleaned paintbrushes in the kitchen sink. "Thank you for fixing the faucet, and for—" Diego paused, searching for words. "For not making this weird. I know this isn't your world." Alexander looked around the small apartment, then at Luna, who was arranging her stuffed animals in her newly painted room, humming happily to herself. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think it might be exactly the world I've been looking for." The evening started like any other in the month since Alexander had begun regularly visiting Luna and Diego. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine: takeout dinner on Wednesday nights, homework help when Luna needed it, and weekend projects that gradually transformed their small apartment into something warmer and more functional. Alexander had learned to navigate their tiny kitchen, Diego had grown comfortable accepting his help with household expenses, and Luna had stopped looking surprised every time Alexander showed up when he said he would. But tonight felt different. Luna was unusually quiet during dinner, picking at her favorite Chinese takeout without her usual animated chatter about school and friends. When Alexander asked about her day, she gave short, distracted answers, and when Diego tried to engage her in their usual post-dinner routine of reviewing her homework, she claimed she didn't have any. "Luna," Diego said gently, crouching down to her eye level as she sat curled up on the couch. "What's going on, Mija? You've been quiet all evening." Luna looked between Diego and Alexander, her green eyes swimming with tears she was trying hard not to shed. "Can I ask you guys something? And will you promise to tell me the truth?" Alexander felt his chest tighten with sudden apprehension. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "Today at school, Emma Rodriguez, she's in 5th grade. She said something that didn't make sense." Luna's voice was small and uncertain. "She said her older sister works at the hospital where Mama used to work, and that her sister told her Mama was already married to Papa when I was born." The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Alexander felt his heart stop, while Diego's face went completely pale. "But that doesn't make sense," Luna continued, her voice growing more distressed. "Because Mr. Alexander is my biological papa, right? That's why we look alike and do the same things with our ears when we're nervous. But if Mama was already married to Papa when I was born—" She trailed off, her 8-year-old mind working through implications that neither man had been prepared to explain. Diego closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were filled with a pain that Alexander recognized all too well. "Luna, sweetheart." "Was Emma lying?" Luna interrupted, her voice desperate now. Because if Mama was married to Papa when I was born, then that means—" She looked directly at Alexander, and he saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in her eyes. "That means you left her. When she was pregnant with me, you left her." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Alexander felt every carefully built wall of rationalization crumble around him. Luna wasn't asking for explanations or excuses. She was stating a fact, and the horror in her young voice made it clear exactly what she thought of that fact. "Luna, it's complicated," Alexander began, but she cut him off. "It's not complicated," Luna's voice rose, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Either you stayed with Mama when she needed you or you didn't. Either you wanted me or you didn't." "I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" "That babies need their daddies. That being pregnant is scary. That Mama would need help." Luna stood up from the couch, her small body trembling with an anger that seemed too big for her frame. "Papa says people who love each other don't abandon each other when things get hard." Alexander looked helplessly at Diego, searching for some kind of support or intervention, but Diego's expression was carefully neutral, not hostile, but not helpful either. This was Alexander's mess to clean up. "Luna, I was young and scared. Papa was young too. He told me he was only 24 when he married Mama, and he was scared about being a good enough husband and father. But he didn't run away." Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow, but it was the comparison to Diego that cut deepest. Luna was absolutely right. Diego had been younger, had fewer resources, probably had every reason to be overwhelmed by the prospect of marrying a pregnant woman and taking on instant fatherhood. But he'd stayed. "You're right," Alexander said quietly. "I should have stayed. I should have fought for her, for you. I should have been brave like Diego was." "Then why didn't you?" Luna's question was so simple, so direct, that it stripped away every sophisticated justification he'd ever constructed. Alexander looked at this remarkable little girl, his daughter, and realized that she deserved the complete, unvarnished truth, even if it painted him in the worst possible light. "Because I was selfish," he said finally, "because I cared more about what my family thought than what Isabella needed. Because I was afraid that choosing her would cost me everything I thought I wanted. Money, status, my family's approval." "But she was having your baby," Luna said, her voice breaking. "I was your baby. Didn't that matter more than money?" The question hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. It should have. You should have mattered more than anything. Luna wiped her nose with the back of her hand, leaving a streak across her cheek. "Mama died because I was born, didn't she? That's why Papa gets sad sometimes when he looks at pictures of her." "No, Luna." Diego spoke for the first time since the conversation began, his voice urgent. "Mija, your mama died because sometimes bad things happen to good people. It had nothing to do with you being born. But if Mr. Alexander had stayed, if he'd been there to help, maybe Mama wouldn't have been so tired and stressed. Maybe she wouldn't have gotten sick." Luna's logic was devastating in its childlike clarity. Alexander felt like he was drowning. "Luna, your mother got sick because her body couldn't fight off an infection. It wasn't because of stress or being alone. It was just a terrible accident that nobody could have prevented." "You don't know that," Luna said fiercely. "You weren't there. You don't know how hard it was for her, or how much help she needed, or whether having you there might have made the difference." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Alexander looked at Diego, expecting to see agreement or vindication in his expression, but instead he saw something that looked almost like pity. "Luna," Diego said gently, "what happened to your mama wasn't anyone's fault. Not yours, not mine, not even Alexander's. Sometimes we want to blame someone when bad things happen because it feels better than accepting that sometimes life is just unfair." "But he still left her," Luna said stubbornly. "He still chose money over family." "Yes," Diego agreed quietly, "he did, and that was wrong. But punishing him forever won't bring your mama back, and it won't change what happened." Luna turned to look at Alexander, and he saw something in her expression that broke his heart completely. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disappointment. The kind of deep, soul-crushing disappointment that only children could deliver with such devastating precision. "I thought you were different," she said quietly. "I thought maybe you were the kind of person who made mistakes but learned from them. But you're just like the kids at school who are nice to me when they want something but ignore me when it's not convenient." "Luna, that's not—" "Yes, it is," she interrupted. "You're being nice to me now because you feel guilty and because Papa makes me happy, so I'm convenient. But when I was inconvenient, when I was just a problem Mama had to deal with alone, you disappeared." Alexander felt tears burning behind his eyes. "You're right. You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix anything," Luna said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Sorry doesn't give me back 8 years of having a real father. Sorry doesn't make Mama less dead or Papa less tired from doing everything by himself." The room fell silent except for Luna's quiet sniffling. Alexander looked at this extraordinary child who had just delivered the most devastating character assessment he'd ever received, and realized that every word was true. He had been selfish, cowardly, and weak. He had abandoned the woman he claimed to love, and the child who shared his DNA. And now, 8 years later, he was trying to buy his way back into their lives with money and good intentions. "What can I do?" he asked quietly. "How can I make this right?" Luna looked at him for a long moment, her green eyes older than any 8-year-old's should be. "I don't know if you can," she said finally. "Papa says some things can't be fixed, only forgiven, but I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet." She turned to Diego, who opened his arms without hesitation. Luna climbed into his lap and buried her face against his shoulder, her small body shaking with tears she'd been holding back. "I want to go to bed now," she said in a muffled voice. "Of course, Mita. Go brush your teeth and I'll be in to read you a story in a few minutes." After Luna disappeared into the bathroom, Alexander and Diego sat in heavy silence. Finally, Alexander spoke. "She's right about everything," he said quietly. "Yeah," Diego agreed. "She is. I don't know how to come back from this. How to prove that I've changed, that I'm not the same person who walked away from Isabella." Diego was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of Luna brushing her teeth in the bathroom. "You can't prove it," he said finally. "You can only live it. Day by day, choice by choice. And even then, she might never forgive you. You have to be okay with that possibility." Alexander nodded, knowing Diego was right. He had spent 8 years running from the consequences of his choices, and now he was facing them in the form of a heartbroken little girl who saw right through him. The question was, would he finally have the courage to stay and face the truth, even if it meant losing the chance at the family he'd only just begun to want? 3 weeks had passed since Luna's devastating confrontation with Alexander, and the silence felt like a living thing in the space between them. Diego had tried to maintain their routine, weekly dinners, weekend projects, but Luna participated with polite distance, treating Alexander like a well-meaning stranger rather than family. She answered his questions with single words, declined his offers to help with homework, and found excuses to be in her room whenever he visited. Alexander had thrown himself into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts, but even 16-hour days couldn't silence Luna's words echoing in his mind. "Sorry doesn't give me back 8 years of having a real father." It was a Thursday evening when Diego's panicked call shattered the artificial normalcy Alexander had been trying to maintain. "Alexander, I need your help." Diego's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "Luna collapsed at school today. They rushed her to Mercy General, and the doctors, they're saying things I don't understand, but it sounds serious." Alexander was already reaching for his coat before Diego finished speaking. "What kind of serious? What happened?" "They think it might be her heart, some kind of defect that's been getting worse. She's been complaining about being tired lately, but I thought it was just stress from—" Diego's voice broke slightly. "From everything that's been happening with us." "I'm coming right now. Which floor?" "Pediatric ICU, 4th floor." "Alexander, Diego paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with emotion. "I can't lose her. She's everything I have." Alexander ended the call and ran for the elevator, his mind racing with fragments of medical terms and worst-case scenarios. As his Tesla raced through the city streets toward Mercy General, he found himself making the same desperate bargains with the universe that he'd once mocked other people for believing in. If Luna was okay, he'd never ask for forgiveness again. If she recovered, he'd disappear from their lives completely if that's what would make her happy. He found Diego in the ICU waiting room, still wearing his work clothes, his face ashen and his hands shaking as he clutched a paper cup of cold coffee. When Diego saw him, something like relief flickered across his features. "Any news?" Alexander asked, settling into the plastic chair beside him. "They're running tests, something about irregular heartbeat and fluid around her heart. The cardiologist is supposed to come talk to me soon." Diego's voice was mechanical, like he was reciting facts to keep from falling apart. She was fine this morning. Made her lunch, walked her to school, complained about math homework. How was she fine this morning and now? "She's going to be okay," Alexander said firmly, though he had no basis for that certainty beyond desperate hope. "You don't know that." Diego turned to look at him, and Alexander saw fear so raw it was painful to witness. What if she's not? What if I lose her too? What if all this stress and upheaval we've put her through made her condition worse? "Diego, stop. This isn't anyone's fault." "Isn't it?" Diego's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from other worried families in the waiting room. "She's been dealing with finding out about you, learning about Isabella's past, trying to process why her biological father abandoned her. Kids internalize stress, Alexander. What if her body couldn't handle all the emotional turmoil?" The accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow, but before he could respond, a doctor in scrubs approached them. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that came from delivering difficult news to frightened parents. "Mr. Martinez? I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Luna's cardiologist. Is this your partner?" Diego glanced at Alexander, and for a moment Alexander thought he might correct the assumption. Instead, Diego simply nodded. "This is Alexander. He's Luna's other father." Dr. Chen settled into a chair across from them, her expression serious but not devastating. "Luna has what's called a congenital heart defect, specifically a ventricular septal defect with some complications that have developed over time. It's essentially a hole between the chambers of her heart that's been getting larger." "Is she gonna die?" Diego's question was blunt, desperate. "Not if we act quickly. Luna needs surgery to repair the defect, but it's a procedure we perform regularly with excellent success rates. The concern is that her symptoms have been escalating, which means we can't wait much longer." Alexander felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by new fear. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "Ideally, within the next week. However, there's a complication." Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Luna will need blood transfusions during and after the surgery. Her blood type is AB negative, which is quite rare. Our blood bank has some units, but for a surgery this complex on a child her size, we'd prefer to have directed donations from family members if possible." "I'll get tested right away," Diego said without hesitation. "Of course. We'll test you first thing in the morning. However, I should mention that biological relatives are often the best matches for these situations." "Is Luna's biological father available?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander looked at Diego, who was staring at his hands. "I'm her biological father," Alexander said quietly. "I'll take the test too." Dr. Chen nodded efficiently. "Excellent. We'll test both of you and see who's the better match. In the meantime, Luna is stable, but we're monitoring her closely. Would you like to see her?" They followed Dr. Chen down a sterile hallway lined with rooms containing other people's worst fears. Through the window of Luna's room, Alexander could see her small form dwarfed by the hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, tracking the irregular rhythm of her damaged heart. "She's been asking for both of you," Dr. Chen said softly. "Children do better when they feel supported during medical procedures." Diego entered the room first, moving to Luna's bedside with the careful urgency of someone afraid of disturbing something precious. "Hey, Mika, how are you feeling?" Luna's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Diego, her face relaxed into something approaching a smile. "Papa, I'm sorry I scared you. I didn't mean to get sick." "Don't apologize for being sick, sweetheart. That's not how illness works." Diego brushed her hair back from her forehead, and Alexander saw his hands trembling with the effort to appear calm. Luna's gaze shifted to Alexander, who had remained near the doorway, uncertain of his welcome. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then, quietly, she said, "Mr. Alexander, will you come sit with me too?" Alexander approached the bed slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile peace Luna was offering. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Tired. And scared." Luna's voice was smaller than usual, stripped of its usual confident chatter. "The doctors say I need an operation on my heart." "The doctors are very good here," Alexander said gently. "They're going to take excellent care of you." "Will you stay, both of you?" Luna looked between Alexander and Diego with the vulnerability of a child who suddenly understood that the world wasn't as safe as she'd believed. "Wild horses couldn't drag us away," Diego said immediately. Alexander nodded, his throat too tight for words. Luna's small hand reached out from under the hospital blankets, and without thinking, he took it in his own. Her fingers were warm but fragile, and he could feel the irregular flutter of her pulse through her thin skin. "I need to tell you something," Luna said, her voice serious despite her exhaustion. "I've been thinking about what I said before about not forgiving you. And I realized something." Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. "What's that?" "Papa always says that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. And I don't want to be poisoned anymore." Luna's green eyes were clear and direct. "I'm still hurt that you left, Mama, and I don't understand how you could do that. But I don't want to be angry when I'm scared." "Luna, I'm not saying everything is okay," she continued. "I'm just saying that if something happens to me, I don't want the last thing between us to be me being mean to you." The words hit Alexander like a thunderbolt. Here was this 8-year-old child, facing surgery and uncertainty, and her concern was for his feelings. She was offering him grace he hadn't earned and forgiveness he didn't deserve, not because he'd proven himself worthy of it, but because she was too good to carry the weight of anger into whatever came next. "Nothing is going to happen to you," Alexander said fiercely. "I promise. Whatever you need, the best doctors, the best hospital, anything, you'll have it." "I just need you both to be here," Luna said simply. "That's all I want." As Alexander sat beside Luna's hospital bed, holding her small hand while Diego held the other, he realized that this moment had stripped away every pretense and justification. He wasn't here as Luna's biological father or as Diego's reluctant partner in co-parenting. He was here as someone who loved this remarkable child and would do anything to ensure her safety. The question now wasn't whether Luna would forgive him or whether Diego would accept him. The question was whether he could finally become the kind of man who deserved to be part of their family, not through genetics or money or good intentions, but through the kind of love that showed up in hospital rooms and stayed no matter what the doctors said. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood what it meant to put someone else's needs above his own fear. And as Luna drifted off to sleep between the two men who loved her most, he made a silent promise that whatever happened next, he would finally be brave enough to deserve the trust she was offering him. The lab results came back at 6:47 a.m. on a gray Friday morning, delivered by Dr. Chen with the kind of professional efficiency that masked what Alexander suspected was deliberate timing. Early enough to avoid the chaos of shift changes, late enough that both men had spent a sleepless night in the ICU waiting room, drinking bad coffee and watching their daughter sleep between monitoring alarms. "We have the blood work results," Dr. Chen announced, settling into the chair across from where Alexander and Diego sat side by side, both looking like they'd been through a war. "The good news is that both of you are compatible donors. The interesting news is what the tests revealed about genetic markers." Alexander felt his chest tighten. Beside him, Diego went very still. "Mr. Blackstone, as Luna's biological father, you're an excellent match as we expected. But Mr. Martinez..." Dr. Chen paused, consulting her chart with the sort of careful attention that suggested she was delivering information that would change lives. "Your blood work shows some unusual markers that typically indicate a much closer genetic relationship than step-parent." "What kind of relationship?" Diego's voice was barely above a whisper. "The markers suggest a sibling relationship. Specifically, the kind of genetic similarity we see between half-siblings who share one biological parent." The words hit the small waiting room like a bomb going off in slow motion. Alexander stared at Dr. Chen, his mind struggling to process what she was telling them. Diego had gone completely white, his hands gripping the arms of his plastic chair so tightly his knuckles showed bone white through his skin. "That's impossible," Alexander said slowly. "Diego and I aren't related. We didn't even know each other before." "Before Luna," Diego finished quietly, his voice strange and distant, We didn't know each other before Luna. Dr. Chen looked between them with the sort of careful neutrality that medical professionals mastered when delivering life-altering information. I should mention that these genetic markers don't lie. If you'd like, we can run more comprehensive tests to confirm the relationship, but preliminary results are quite clear. Run them, Alexander said immediately. Run every test you have. I'll have the lab process a full panel. Results should be available by this evening. Dr. Chen stood, then paused. In the meantime, either of you would be excellent donors for Luna's surgery. The genetic compatibility just means we have more options than we initially thought. After she left, Alexander and Diego sat in silence that felt dense with the weight of revelation and possibility. Finally, Diego spoke. "My mother," he said quietly, staring at his hands. "She worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families when I was growing up. One family in particular, from when I was very young until I was about 12. Alexander's blood ran cold. "What family?" "The Blackstones. She cleaned house for them 3 days a week for almost 15 years. Diego's voice was carefully controlled, but Alexander could hear the emotion underneath. "She used to tell me stories about the family she worked for, the cold mother, the distant father, the lonely little boy who was being raised more by tutors and nannies than his own parents." "Diego." "She said the little boy was smart and sad and asked too many questions for his parents' liking. Said he reminded her of me, actually. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking." Diego finally looked up, meeting Alexander's gaze directly. "She said his name was Alexander." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Alexander remembered Maria, the quiet woman who had cleaned their house, who had been more present in his childhood than either of his actual parents. She had been the one who bandaged his scraped knees, who listened to his school presentations, who remembered his birthday when his parents were too busy with business trips. "Maria," Alexander breathed, "your mother was Maria Martinez." "Maria Santos when she worked for your family. She didn't take my father's name until after I was born." Diego's voice was steady, but there were tears in his eyes. "She never told me who my father was. Just said he was someone who couldn't be part of our lives. Someone from a different world who had responsibilities that didn't include us." "My father," Alexander said quietly, the understanding hitting him like a physical blow. "She had an affair with my father. Apparently, though knowing my mother, it probably wasn't just an affair. She didn't do anything casual. She loved completely or not at all." Diego wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "She died when I was 18, cancer. Never told me the truth about my paternity, just said some secrets were better left buried." Alexander thought about his father, cold, demanding, utterly focused on business success and family reputation. The idea of him having an affair with the housekeeper was shocking, but not impossible. What was shocking was the realization that Alexander had grown up in the same house as his half-brother, that Diego had been raised by a woman who had known more about love and nurturing than both of their fathers combined. "That means Luna isn't just my daughter," Alexander said slowly. "She's your niece, your biological niece. And you're not just some stranger who abandoned the woman I loved. You're my half-brother who abandoned the woman I loved." Diego's voice carried a complexity of emotions, hurt, anger, bewilderment, and something that might have been relief. "Did you know? When Isabella told you she was pregnant, did you know the father was—" "I knew his name was Alexander Blackstone. I knew he was some wealthy tech executive who had broken her heart and disappeared when things got complicated." Diego stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. "I never connected it to the Alexander from my mother's stories. Different last name, different world, and honestly, I was too focused on taking care of Isabella to think much about the man who'd hurt her. But if you had known—" "What? Would it have changed anything?" Diego turned back to face him. "You still abandoned her. You still chose your family's approval over her well-being. The fact that we shared DNA doesn't excuse that." Alexander nodded, understanding that Diego was absolutely right. "But it explains some things, why Luna feels so comfortable with both of us, why we work together so naturally despite coming from completely different backgrounds, why she looks at us sometimes like we make perfect sense to her." "Kids are smart about these things," Diego agreed quietly. "They pick up on connections that adults miss." They stood in silence for a moment, both processing the implications of what they'd learned. Finally, Alexander spoke. "What do we tell Luna?" "The truth. She deserves that much." Diego returned to his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Though I'm not sure an 8-year-old is going to understand the complexity of having a father and an uncle who are the same person. Or why her mother fell in love with her uncle instead of trying to reconnect her with her biological father." "Isabella made the right choice," Alexander said quietly. "You were the better man. You still are." "Don't." Diego's voice was sharp. "Don't make this about comparing ourselves. Isabella didn't choose me because I was better than you. She chose me because I was there, because I showed up when she needed someone, because I proved I could be trusted with her heart." "And with Luna's." "And with Luna's," Diego agreed. "The question now is whether you can prove the same thing." Before Alexander could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me, are you Luna Martinez's family? She's awake and asking for both of you." As they followed the nurse back to Luna's room, Alexander found himself thinking about the strange mathematics of family. Luna was his daughter and his niece. Diego was his brother and his co-parent. Isabella had been the woman he'd loved and lost, and the woman his brother had loved and married. It should have been impossibly complicated, but somehow, walking beside Diego toward the room where Luna was waiting for them, it felt surprisingly simple. They were family, not just because of genetics or marriage certificates or legal documents, but because they'd chosen each other. Diego had chosen Luna when she needed a father. Luna had chosen both of them when she needed family. And now Alexander was finally ready to choose them back, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of love. The only question remaining was whether Luna would accept this new definition of family, and whether the truth about their genetic connections would feel like a gift or just another complication in a life that had already been touched by too much loss. As they entered her room and saw her small face light up at the sight of them both, Alexander realized that Luna had probably already figured out the most important truth. Love wasn't about biology or perfection or never making mistakes. It was about showing up, staying present, and choosing each other over and over again, even when the math didn't add up the way anyone expected. Luna's surgery was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, giving them 4 days to process the revelation about their brotherhood while preparing for the most terrifying day of their lives. But Alexander refused to spend those days sitting in hospital waiting rooms or having awkward conversations about their newfound family connection. He had a promise to keep to an 8-year-old girl who deserved to see that actions mattered more than apologies. His first stop was the law office of Harrison and Associates, where he spent 3 hours with estate planning attorneys, restructuring his will and establishing a trust fund that would ensure Luna's education, medical care, and financial security regardless of what happened to him. But money, he'd learned, was the easy part. The harder part began with a phone call to his mother. Victoria Blackstone received him in her penthouse apartment with the same icy composure she'd maintained throughout his childhood. At 72, she remained formidable. Silver hair perfectly styled, designer clothes immaculate, expression carefully neutral as her son sat across from her in the living room where emotions had always been unwelcome. "You look terrible," she observed without preamble. "Though I suppose that's to be expected, given what I've been hearing about your recent complications." "You know about Luna," it wasn't a question. "I make it my business to know about potential threats to our family's reputation. A granddaughter I've never met, being raised by the housekeeper's son. Yes, I'm aware." Victoria's tone was arctic. "I'm also aware that you've been playing house with them, which explains your recent distraction from business responsibilities." Alexander felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had characterized every conversation with his mother since childhood, but this time it was accompanied by something new, clarity about who he wanted to be. "Her name is Luna Martinez," he said firmly. "She's 8 years old, she's brilliant and brave and kind, and she's your granddaughter, my daughter. Your daughter with a laboratory technician who trapped you with a pregnancy and then conveniently died, leaving you financially responsible for her offspring." Victoria's voice carried the dismissive tone she'd always used when discussing people she considered beneath their social status. "Isabella didn't trap me. I abandoned her when she needed me most. And Diego Martinez, who is also your son, by the way, stepped up to be the father I was too cowardly to be." The mention of Diego caused the first crack in Victoria's composure. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I've discovered that my father had an affair with Maria Santos, who worked as our housekeeper for 15 years. I've discovered that Diego Martinez is my half-brother, and that Maria raised him alone while cleaning up after the family that refused to acknowledge his existence. Alexander's voice grew stronger with each word. I've also discovered that Luna is currently in the hospital with a heart condition that requires surgery, and that both her fathers are doing everything in their power to save her life. Victoria was silent for a long moment, her mask finally slipping to reveal something that might have been vulnerability. Your father never told me about the boy. Did you know about the affair? I suspected, but I also knew that acknowledging it would complicate our lives in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. She stood and walked to the window overlooking the city. Your father and I had an arrangement, Alexander. We prioritized stability, reputation, the business. Personal feelings were secondary. And look how well that worked out. You raised a son who was so afraid of disappointing you that he abandoned the woman he loved and the child she was carrying. You created a family so cold that your own granddaughter doesn't even know you exist. What do you want from me? Victoria's question was sharp, defensive. I want you to meet Luna. I want you to acknowledge Diego as your stepson. I want you to understand that family isn't about bloodlines and business arrangements. It's about showing up for the people you love, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. And if I refuse? Alexander stood, straightening his shoulders with a gesture that Luna would have recognized immediately. Then you'll lose the only son you have left, and you'll never know the most remarkable granddaughter in the world. That afternoon, Alexander drove to the small cemetery where Isabella was buried. He'd never visited her grave before. Hadn't even known where it was until Diego quietly gave him directions while Luna napped between pre-surgery appointments. The headstone was simple granite with fresh flowers that Diego obviously replaced regularly. Isabella Martinez, beloved wife and mother, 1995 to 2017. Below that, in smaller script, she loved with her whole heart. Alexander knelt beside the grave, feeling the weight of 8 years of unspoken words. I'm sorry, he said quietly to the stone and the silence, and the woman who couldn't hear him anymore. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to choose you when it mattered. I'm sorry Luna grew up without knowing her biological father. I'm sorry you had to face everything alone until Diego found you. The wind rustled through the oak tree overhead, and Alexander found himself thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Isabella, 8 years ago in the parking garage of his office building. She'd come to tell him about the pregnancy, and he'd responded with panic about timing and his family's expectations and whether they were ready for such a big step. She'd left that night believing he didn't want her or their child. I want you to know that Diego is exactly the kind of man you deserved. He's everything I wasn't: present, patient, selfless. Luna is lucky to have him as her father, and I'm lucky to have him as my brother. Alexander's voice caught slightly. I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. Not for me, but for Luna. She deserves to have her biological father be someone worthy of the amazing person you raised. He stayed by Isabella's grave for over an hour, talking to her about Luna's laugh, about Diego's devotion, about the family they'd built without him, and the family he was hoping to earn his way into. When he finally stood to leave, he placed his own flowers beside Diego's white lilies that the florist had told him meant rebirth and new beginnings. That evening, Alexander returned to the hospital with a manila folder containing documents that had taken his lawyers all day to prepare. He found Diego in Luna's room, reading her a story while she picked at a dinner that looked only marginally more appetizing than the cardboard it was served on. Papa, tell Mr. Alexander about the funny thing the nurse said. Luna demanded, her spirits improved by pain medication and the prospect of surgery finally fixing her heart. She said Luna has been flirting with the young resident who's been checking on her, Diego reported with a grin. Apparently our daughter is quite the charmer when she's not worried about adult drama. I'm 8, Luna protested. I don't flirt. I'm just friendly to people who are nice to me. Alexander smiled, settling into the chair beside her bed. That's good practice for life, actually. Being kind to people who are kind to you. Like you and Papa, Luna said matter-of-factly. You're both kind to each other now, even though you're nervous about being brothers. Both men stared at her. Luna, how did you? Alexander began. I heard you talking to the doctor yesterday. Also, you look alike when you're worried, and you both do the same thing with your hands when you're thinking. Luna shrugged as if this was obvious. Plus, it makes sense. That's why I felt comfortable with both of you right away. Because you're family, even if you didn't know it. Alexander exchanged a glance with Diego, once again amazed by their daughter's ability to process complex emotional situations with 8-year-old logic. "Since we're all being honest," Alexander said, pulling out the manila folder, "I have something for both of you." He handed Diego a set of documents. "Legal guardianship papers. If something happens to me, I want Luna to stay with you without any question or legal complications. And if something happens to both of us, she'll be financially secure for life." Diego stared at the papers for a long moment. "Alexander, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Luna is your daughter in every way that matters. I'm just the genetics. But I want to make sure that's legally protected, regardless of what my family or anyone else might try to claim in the future. What about custody, visitation rights? Whatever you think is best for Luna. I'm not trying to take her away from you or claim equal parenting time. I just want to be part of her life, if she'll have me." Luna looked between them seriously. "Can I decide?" "Of course," both men said simultaneously. "I want both of you. I want Papa to still be my everyday dad who helps with homework and makes pancakes and knows all my favorite things. And I want Mr. Alexander to be my other dad who teaches me about business stuff and takes me to fancy restaurants and helps Papa when things are hard." She paused, considering. "Is that okay? Can I have two dads who are also brothers?" Alexander felt tears threatening as he looked at this remarkable child who had somehow figured out how to blend their complicated family situation into something that made perfect sense to her 8-year-old heart. "That sounds perfect to me," he said quietly. "Me too, Misha," Diego agreed, his voice rough with emotion. As they sat together in Luna's hospital room the night before her surgery, Alexander realized that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was about showing up consistently, making better choices day by day, and earning trust through actions rather than words. Tomorrow, Luna would have surgery to repair her heart. But tonight, in this small hospital room filled with love and hope and second chances, Alexander finally understood that the most important heart that needed healing had been his own. The surgery took 6 hours and 43 minutes. Alexander and Diego spent those hours in the surgical waiting room drinking terrible coffee and wearing pads in the linoleum floor. They talked sporadically about Luna's recovery timeline, about work schedules and who would take time off, about practical things that kept them from thinking about scalpels and tiny hearts, and all the ways the world could change in the space between one heartbeat and the next. At hour 4, an unexpected visitor appeared in the waiting room doorway. Victoria Blackstone stood there in her perfectly tailored coat, looking as out of place as a diamond in a hardware store, clutching a small wrapped box and wearing an expression Alexander had never seen before: uncertainty. "I came to wait with you," she said simply, settling into one of the plastic chairs as if she belonged there. Diego looked at Alexander with raised eyebrows but said nothing. Victoria had never met Diego officially, though she'd certainly known of his existence since their conversation 2 days ago. "Mother, this is Diego Martinez," Alexander said carefully. "Diego, this is my mother, Victoria Blackstone." "Mrs. Blackstone." Diego's voice was polite, but cautious. "It's just Victoria," she corrected, studying Diego's face with the intensity of someone looking for family resemblances. "You have your mother's eyes. Maria was a remarkable woman." The admission hung in the air like a small bridge across decades of silence. "You remember her," Diego said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I remember her very well. She was one of the few people in our house who showed genuine kindness to Alexander when he was small." Victoria's voice was softer than Alexander had ever heard it. "I also remember that she left rather suddenly when you were about 12. I never knew why until recently." "She found out she was pregnant," Diego said quietly. "And she knew that staying would complicate things for everyone." "Yes, your father was many things, but he was not a man who handled personal complications gracefully." Victoria turned the wrapped box over in her hands. "Maria was better than all of us. She deserved better than the choice she was forced to make." At hour 5, Dr. Chen appeared with an update. Luna was stable, the surgery was progressing well, but the repair was more complex than they'd initially anticipated. Another hour, maybe 2. "She's strong," Dr. Chen assured them, "stronger than most adults I've treated. She keeps asking the anesthesiologist when she can go home and show her dad's her fixed heart." By hour 6, word had somehow spread through the hospital staff that the little girl in Oregon 3 had 2 devoted fathers waiting for her, Nurses stopped by to offer encouragement, other families in the waiting room shared snacks and stories, and someone had started a small betting pool about whether Luna would wake up asking for chocolate ice cream or vanilla. Diego and Alexander both bet chocolate, while Victoria surprised everyone by confidently choosing strawberry. When Dr. Chen finally emerged at 2:47 p.m. wearing surgical scrubs and a tired but genuine smile, all three adults stood up so quickly they nearly knocked over their coffee cups. "The surgery was a complete success," she announced. "Luna's heart is now functioning normally, and all her vital signs are excellent. She's in recovery and asking for both her papas and the fancy lady with the pretty box." Victoria's laugh was startled and delighted. She noticed the box. Apparently, Luna notices everything. She's going to make an excellent recovery, though it'll be about 6 weeks before she's completely back to normal activity levels. They followed Dr. Chen to the recovery room, where Luna lay propped up in bed looking pale but alert, with monitoring wires decorating her small body like technological jewelry. When she saw them, her face lit up with a smile that made Alexander's chest tight with emotion. "Did they fix it?" she asked immediately. "Can you hear my heart working better now?" Diego moved to her bedside first, pressing his ear gently to her chest where the surgical bandages didn't cover. "It sounds perfect, Mija. Strong and steady, just like you." "Mr. Alexander, you listen too," Luna commanded, and Alexander found himself leaning down to hear the miracle of her repaired heart beating with clear, regular rhythm. "Beautiful," he whispered, "the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." Luna turned her attention to Victoria, who had been hanging back near the doorway. "Are you my grandmama?" Victoria stepped forward, her composure finally cracking completely. "I'd very much like to be, if that's acceptable to you." "Papa says family is people who choose to love you even when you're difficult. Are you choosing to love me?" "Very much so," Victoria said, her voice thick with tears she'd probably been holding back for decades. "And I brought you something to celebrate your new heart." She handed Luna the wrapped box, which turned out to contain a delicate silver bracelet with 3 charms: an elephant for memory, a heart for love, and a small letter, L, encrusted with tiny diamonds. "It's beautiful," Luna breathed, holding it up to catch the light. "Can you put it on me, Grandmama?" As Victoria fastened the bracelet around Luna's small wrist with trembling fingers, Alexander realized that his daughter had just accomplished something he'd thought impossible. She'd melted his mother's frozen heart in the space of a single conversation. Over the following weeks, as Luna recovered at home with both her fathers taking turns caring for her, their unusual family settled into a rhythm that somehow worked perfectly, despite defying every conventional definition of normal. Diego remained Luna's primary parent, the one who knew her homework schedule and her favorite breakfast, and exactly how to braid her hair so it stayed neat all day. Alexander became the weekend father and the backup parent, the one who helped with science projects and took her to museums and taught her about business strategy during boring board game afternoons. Victoria, to everyone's surprise, became the grandmother who spoiled Luna with books and art supplies and weekly tea parties, where they discussed everything from elephant conservation to why grown-ups made simple things so complicated. 3 months after Luna's surgery, they gathered for her 9th birthday party in the small apartment that Alexander had quietly helped Diego purchase, not as charity, but as an investment in their shared future. The living room was decorated with balloons and streamers, and the kitchen table groaned under the weight of 2 birthday cakes, chocolate for the main celebration, strawberry for Victoria, who had correctly predicted Luna's post-surgery ice cream preference. "Make a wish, mija," Diego said, as Luna prepared to blow out her candles. Luna closed her eyes tight, her face scrunched in concentration. When she opened them, she looked around the room at her assembled family, Diego and Alexander, Victoria, and several of Luna's school friends who had been fascinated to learn she had both a janitor dad and a CEO dad who were also brothers. "I wished for what I already have," she announced, "a family that chose each other." Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Luna had fallen asleep, surrounded by new books and toys, the 3 adults sat in the living room sharing the last piece of chocolate cake. "I never thought I'd say this," Victoria admitted, "but this is the most functional family I've ever been part of." "It shouldn't work," Diego agreed, "but somehow it does." Alexander looked around the small room, so different from his sterile penthouse, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged, Not because of money, or genetics, or social expectations, but because Luna had seen something in him worth fighting for, and Diego had been generous enough to let him prove himself worthy of the family they'd built. "You know what the best part is?" Alexander said quietly. "Luna will never have to choose between her fathers. She'll never have to wonder if she's loved enough or if she belongs somewhere. She gets to have all of us." 6 months later, when Luna walked across the stage at her school's awards ceremony to receive recognition for her essay on what makes a hero, both Diego and Alexander were in the front row, wearing matching proud father expressions. Her essay, titled "Heroes Show Up," described 3 people who had taught her that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing to be present, day after day, even when it was difficult. As Luna read her essay to the packed auditorium, Alexander thought about the 8-year-old girl who had walked into his office on a Thursday night and asked for help with rent money. She'd gotten so much more than that. She'd gotten a family that proved love multiplied rather than divided, that there was always room for one more person at the table, and that sometimes the most broken people could heal each other simply by choosing to show up. When the ceremony ended and Luna ran toward them with her award clutched in her small hands, Alexander caught Diego's eye and saw the same thought reflected there. They'd gotten the better end of this deal. Luna had asked for help with housing problems, but what she'd really given them was a masterclass in what family could look like when it was built on choice rather than obligation, on presence rather than perfection. "Did you see me up there?" Luna asked breathlessly, launching herself into Diego's arms while Alexander ruffled her hair. "Did you hear what I said about heroes?" "Every word," Diego assured her, "and you're absolutely right. Heroes do show up. Especially when little girls are brave enough to ask them to," Alexander added, thinking about that first night when Luna had appeared in his office like an answered prayer he hadn't known he'd been praying. As they walked out of the school auditorium together, father, brother, daughter, chosen family, Alexander realized that Luna's original question had been answered in ways none of them could have predicted. She'd asked for help staying in the city. Instead, she'd created a home that had nothing to do with geography, and everything to do with the revolutionary idea that love, when shared generously, had the power to heal even the most broken families. Some stories begin with loss and end with redemption. Others begin with desperation and end with hope. But the best stories, Alexander thought as he watched Luna skip ahead of them toward the car, chattering excitedly about ice cream and homework and plans for the weekend, begin with a child brave enough to ask for what her family needs, and end with adults finally wise enough to say yes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.